Okay, Shalom Aleichem. Our topic is grandparents and grandchildren. Um, the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren in halacha, which is an extremely broad topic, but we're going to be uh, drawing on two different shuvas, two different responsa today. One from Rabbi Kiva Eger, that's all, and the other from, you should live and be well, the Rav Moshe Sternbach, Shlita, the Chuvas Vanagos. Now, the uh, the topic of grandparents is dealt with, and Yoel and I have been discussing this the last couple of days, is dealt with in a number of sources and in a number of ways, and it affects many areas because there are many areas in halacha where the issue of a child or a parent is relevant, and so the natural question that always is going to be asked is, if this applies to a parent, does it also apply to a grandparent? Now, the the Gemara deals with this directly in a number of places. Talmud Torah. So the Gemara has a whole discussion, a whole machlokas tanoim, about whether grandparents are chayiv in Talmud Torah towards their grandchildren. Kibud Aveim is a big machlokas rishonim because it's not spoken about directly. And in Pru when it comes to whether what kind of descendants allow a person to fulfill the mitzvah of Pru be fruitful and multiply, of having children, so that's a discussion in the Gemara Yevamos Daf Samach Beis. Three areas that are going to be dealt with in these tshuvas are not mentioned. One is bris milah, another is in the same tshuva Pidyon Ben, and the third is the Seder night. V'igada levincha b'yomahu, the mitzvah of telling over the story of the Exodus to your children. What about grandchildren? So the tshuva of Rabbi Kiva Eger is in the first volume, Siman Membet, and he's writing to Rav Folk, the Av Bezdin of Shlezin. And here's the case: there was a bris milah of a yasam of an orphan whose grandfather was the Moel. So now, the question was, the Rav himself, the Rav of this community, he held that the bracha of Lachniso Lebriso Shel Avram Avinu, which is usually the bracha that is said by the father, so he held that in this case, the Moel, who is the grandfather, should not only say the bracha of Ala Milah, which is the bracha that the Moel says, but also the bracha of Lachniso Lebriso Shel Avram Avinu. And people in the community there disagreed. Umisnagdim lenegdo, they opposed this approach. Ve'omrim de'atofes hatinok yivarech lachniso kedekasa vatur ve'arayvet ve'arava. There's a discussion of what to do with a child who's a yasom. So they would have somebody be the sandik, somebody holding the child, and that person would say lachniso lebriso shel avram avinu. Now, in a standard bris, father, child, Moel. So the Moel says, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher kidsham mitzvah tzivanu ala milah, and the father says, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech olam asher kidsham mitzvah tzivanu lachniso lebriso shel avram avinu. And then he says, Shechianu, that's the minhag here in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Rabbi Kiva Eger in this tshuva goes through Shalom Ariel goes through a number of topics, and one of the topics is the status of a grandfather. So first of all, though, he says, what is going on with this statement of the Tur and the Ravid and the Ramah, that when you're doing a bris and the father is not present, that the person who's holding the baby says Lachniso lebriso shel avram avinu. So he says as follows: the Gemara says that if the father doesn't do bris milah, the beis din is chayav to do the milah. Now, beis din here doesn't mean beis din qua court, but the Jewish community represented by the beis din who is leading the community. So then, it's the beis din who is appointing somebody as the shliach to be involved in getting this bris done. Now, there's something interesting here because there's already bracha on bris milah. So what's his second bracha? Lachniso lebriso shel Avram Avinu. So Rabbi Kiva Eger describes the following: that what the bracha is a bracha, and which is usually said by the father, that the father is bringing the child through the bris. He's beginning to bring the child into the covenant, and he's going to be doing more mitzvahs. He's going to be doing pidyon haben. He's going to be doing teaching Torah, etc. So now, says Rabbi Kiva Eger, and here let's touch down to the grandfather part. In Kain yesh lomar zehu b'mol ba'alma. That's in general when there's a normal mohel. So he wouldn't make lachniso shel levriso shel Avram Avinu because he wouldn't make two brachas over one mitzvah, and we split it up. But when it's the grandfather, al be'avia av, delo shaychus inyan habracha yoser me'acher. This particular bracha of lachniso lebriso shel Avram Avinu, he's more shaykh to it. He's more connected with it than anybody else. De'af de b'mila lo amrina b'sugya de'hechi deleka av de'chayav avi av lemulo. It's true that the Gemara does not say that if the father's not there, that the grandfather does bris milah. It says the beis din does it. However, v'rak linya lelamdo Torah amrina kein b'kiddushin. With regards to teaching Torah, it says that the grandfather is teaching his grandson Torah, and it's learned out. That's the machlokas in Chazal, but the way we paskin is that it's learned out from the pasuk of Ahodatam levanecha v'libnei vanecha, that you should tell not only to your children but to your children's children. And telling here is not only about the Mount Sinai episode, but the contents of the Mount Sinai episode. He's more connected. Ki Lavush kasav. The Lavush said, Lavush is Rab Mordechai Yafeh. He was a contemporary of the Maharal. That's a way to place him. The beginning of the period of the Achronim. Kasav diyesh matmin lama yivarechav lachniso. Why is the father saying that bracha? Ha'hamal shlucho, or amol shlucho. He sent the moel to do the bris milah for him. Ushlucho shalom kamoso. And the shliach is taking the place of the person. V'kevet she'amol mevarech ala milah, matzorach lav levarech lachniso. Harei amila hi briso shel Avram Avinu. Well, isn't this just a repetitive bracha? V'yesh meforshim. This is what we said before, but now we're reading inside. De birkas lachniso eino klal ala milah. The bracha of bringing him into the covenant isn't on the bris milah. Raka'av meshabeach u'mevarech la'Hashem. He's praising God. Shemiyom hahu v'hala mutal alev od mitzvos acheros hanigroros achar milah. From that day on, there's other mitzvahs that are drawn after the milah. Meaning that's just a chain of mitzvahs. Heim mitzvah, hein deheim shemitzvah liftoso imu bechor ululamdo Torah ulasio isha. The whole Mishnah in Kiddushin that says the chovos of ha'aval ben, the chovos that a father is obligated towards his child. So I mixed up the lashon. So the chovos that a father is obligated towards his child. Well, he's just starting them out now. So now, says the father, I am blessing you that I'm beginning to bring him into the covenant. But the fact that there's a covenant between this child and Hashem, well, I'm gonna be doing other things that are connected with this. So, now, why should the grandfather have a specific connection? Well, we know that a grandfather is chayav to teach the grandson Torah. So, Keva de B'Chleilanu Lamdo Torah, included in the mitzvah, in the obligations that a father has towards his son. One of them is to teach him Torah. Shezeu chiyuv gomara aviav haben. That's an obligation on the grandfather also. The mechuyev afilu liskor melamed, and it's going to come out of his pocket. He even is obligated, if he has to, if there's a need, to pay for a melamed to teach his grandson. So lachniso is obligated to the. If you look at all the people in the room at this bris, so the one who is most shayach to the bracha of lachniso l'riso shel Avraham Avinu is the grandfather, because the grandfather, according to the Levush's reading of that bracha, because the grandfather is the one who's going to be obligated to teach this child Torah. So he's the one who's bringing the child into the bris that will drag along with it many mitzvahs. And one of those is teaching Torah. So a stam shliach beistin, somebody who's a representative of the community, is not going to be the one that is going to be obligated to teach this child Torah, but the grandfather will. Now, he goes further, and he says that and it's interesting, by the way, I didn't expect this from Rabbi Akiva Eiger, but the tshuva ends up being connecting some of the, what we would usually call Jewish thought ideas, machshava ideas, about the connection between Bris Milah and Talmud Torah, and he sees them as justifying that the grandfather should say lachniso l'riso shel Avraham Avinu. Let's see what he says. We find in the Gemara, we find in the Mishnah at the end of the third parak of Nedarim, Gedola Milah. Milah is great. She'el mali he lo bara HaKadosh Baruch Hu lomo. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world for Bris Milah. What does that mean? Shenamar im lo brisi yom balayla chukot shamayim va'aretz lo samti. I wouldn't have set in motion all the laws of nature, the laws of the heavens and earth, if not for my covenant day and night. And Chazal also said, Gedola Torah shel malei Torah lo niskaimu shamayim va'aretz. Without Torah, heaven and earth wouldn't be existent. Shenamar im lo brisi yom v'layla chukot shamayim va'aretz lo santi. Now, it's interesting in that Gemara because it sounds like Bris Milah and Torah are both the subject of that pasuk. But he says that's interesting. Bris Milah, Torah is day and night, v'gisa bo yom v'layla. But Bris Milah is only done in the day. So he said there's an explanation that the Tosas Yom Tov brings, but he says the following explanation seems more. Yosener derbemis Milah v'Torah shaychen la'adari. Milah and Torah are connected. They're connected mitzvahs. Milah is the external and Torah is the internal. The external Milah is leading towards the internal Milah, which is, so to speak, circumcising orlas halev, our heart, that which is covering up our heart, to open up our heart to Torah. So, imkein Milah mavo lemilas halev, lahavin lahaskil b'Torah v'mitzvos, that, and I assume what he means is kedusha in areas of his life where kedusha is especially shayach. So that is going to lead towards the inner, so to speak, circumcision. And so Torah and bris are interconnected. So because Torah is Yom V'Layla, bris is also Yom V'Layla, even though practically we only do the bris during the day. But the bris is intimately connected with something that is day and night, which is Talmud Torah. So reason number one, says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that the grandfather should say Lachniso l'riso shalom Avinu, is because he's the one who is obligated in Talmud Torah towards his grandson. But then he goes further. V'gam keva de b'chol makom amrina b'nei banim hereim kebanim. We always say that b'nei banim heim kebanim. Yesh lo shaychus lozeh yoser mi'acher, so he's more connected than others. And the Be'er Sheva wrote in the book Tzedel Laderech at length on Pidyon HaBen that a grandfather can redeem his grandson. And he said, not only the Beis Din or others can redeem him, but kol shekein v'chav v'chomer she'meis ha'av kodem ha'padiyah she'achol avi aviv lifdoso, that the grandfather can certainly, if the father passed away, can certainly redeem his grandson. Shaharihu adif tvei lifdoso ke'echad me'acher. He's better than others. Why? To b'nei banim kebanim. That grandchildren are like children. So you see that with regards to Pidyon HaBen, according to the Sefer Be'er Sheva, according to the author of the Sefer Be'er Sheva in his Sefer Tzedel Laderech, so you see that Pidyon HaBen can be done by the grandfather, because B'nei Banim Hareim Kebanim, grandchildren are considered like children. So similarly, the same should apply to Bris Milah. So he gives two he gives two reasons why the grandfather should say Lachniso Levriso Shalom Ravinu. Number one, because the grandfather is Chayv in Talmud Torah towards the child, and Bris Milah and Talmud Torah are intimately connected. And Lachniso is entering the bris, entering the covenant, and it includes the mitzvahs that are coming up. But even further, the grandfather is like a father. Now, that was a controversial statement, because there's a big machlokas about whether a grandfather is the object of kibbud av v'em. We saw this morning in the yeshiva, the Ma'arik, Rabbi Yosef Kolon, so he says that when it comes to Saint Kaddish, the grandson is no different than anybody else. And a grandson is not obligated on kibbud av v'em, and Kaddish for a parent is based on kibbud av v'em, and a grandson is not obligated. And he has a couple proofs, but one of his what seems to jump out there from the source is that we don't find the Gemara talking about kibbud av v'em for a grandparent, even though it talks about kibbud av v'em for a step-parent, stepfather, stepmother, and an older sibling. Though that's a blatant omission. Not only that, there's two Gemaras which imply very strongly that kibbud av v'em doesn't apply to a grandson, at least according to Rashi. One where Rav Acha bar Yaakov's grandson Yaakov, who was the son of his daughter, so he asked his, it's an agadic comment, but it seems to reflect on halacha. He asked his grandson, Rav Acha bar Yaakov asked his grandson, can you bring me water to drink? And the grandson said, I'm not your son, and I'm not chayiv in kibbud av v'em. Rashi says, and I'm not chayiv in kibbud av v'em because a grandson's not chayiv in kibbud av v'em for a grandfather. Similarly, the Gemara says that in a tragic situation where a father killed a son, who can serve as the goel adam? Who can serve as the next of kin that avenges the blood? So the Gemara's final conclusion is that the son of the murder victim can serve as the goel adam, as the redeemer of the blood, because that involves the relationship between him and his grandfather, and as Rashi says, there's no chiyuv kibbud av v'em vis-a-vis a grandfather. Whereas the brother of the murder victim, who is the son of this father, cannot serve as the goel adam. So Rashi in both cases says very clearly that kibbud av v'em is not incumbent on a grandson. One is a case of a son, and the other is a case of a son of a daughter. So that's pretty strong. And the Marik says, and it's a blatant omission, the fact that we don't find about kibbut aveim for a grandson. And this this expression, b'nei banim hareim kebanim, grandchildren are like children, that's limited to Piri Verivia. That's limited to the mitzvah of having children, where we're concerned about offspring. And so when we're concerned about offspring, we want to know if that son and daughter continue on. And so if a son and daughter, if a person gave birth to a son and a daughter, and the son and the daughter died, and they have children, so b'nei banim hareim kebanim, grandchildren are like children, and therefore this person has really fulfilled kibbut aveim. But it's a principle that should be limited to its context. So that's Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger seems to be seeing b'nei banim hareim kebanim as a broader principle as opposed to the Marik. Now, there's a mitzvah on the Seder night of v'higadeta levincha bayomahu, that besides Zachoras Hayom Hazer Asher Yatzasa Mimitzrayim, which Rambam so beautifully presents as is Zachor, the same way we say Zachoras Yom HaShabbos Lakadsho, that there's a mitzvah to tell about the Pesach miracles, similar to the way there's a mitzvah to speak out about Kedushas HaShabbos, and that's independent of a child. That's afilu kulanu chachamim kulanu nevonim. However, there's an extra level of the mitzvah, which is v'higadeta levincha bayomahu. So there's two aspects of the Seder night. On this second aspect of v'higadeta levincha, what about grandchildren? So says Rav Sternbach, there's a very common practice of people having a Seder, and the grandfather runs the Seder, and the grandfather's children are there, and they're there with their young children. So now you have an interesting situation, because you have parents who are not actively the ones who are doing the v'higadeta lebincha b'yomahu. It seems to be the grandfather who's doing it. So ask Rav Sternbach, Uve'ikar mitzvah sipur yetzias Mitzrayim, with regards to telling over the story of Egypt, yesh litmo ala minhag shebanim nisui mitarchim b'leil seder eitz al ha'orim eitz al ha'chotein, that married children are by their parents or by their in-laws, biyachadim b'neim heim, with their sons, and it turns out that the grandfather is leading the Seder, and the parents are quiet most of the time. And they seem to be not fulfilling the biblical mitzvah of telling the story to your children. And it is a very puzzling thing. There are obligations that a father has that he can hire somebody else to do it. So a father is obligated to teach his son Torah, but he can hire a Melamed. A father is obligated to do bris milah, but he can have a moel do it in his place. So here the main thing is that the child should know about Yetzias Mitzrayim. He has outsourced this particular mitzvah to his father or his father-in-law. That's the reason why they got it there. That's the reason why they went to the in-laws. So that is very interesting. That basically the grandfather is a shaliach of the father to do Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. However, he says, Miu lemaisa ein dati nocha b'chach. I don't feel comfortable about this. Dahadamatzinu sheshlichus moel kamo asa mishalech. When we say that agency works, and when an agent does something, sells a field, let's say, it's as if the person himself who sent him sold the field. It's like he gave power of attorney to somebody. Jim is selling a field to Bob, and he gives power of attorney to his his lawyer. So Jim sold the field through his lawyer. So he says, "Hainu dafka begavna dashliach asa osa ma'isa mamish k'mo ha'mishalech," because the selling is done by the shaliach, just like the mishalech would have done it. Same thing when a person sends a shliach to do kiddushin or gittin, they do exactly what the chassan or the husband would do. However, in our case where the grandfather is telling all of them at once, that's not like a father explaining to each child in the special way that would be appropriate to that child. It is common that the father would be mashpia more, would be influenced more. And the shliach isn't doing it as well as the father. It seems to me that the beginning should be done by the father himself. He should ask his father, and the father should explain. Very fascinating. And he should explain the foundations of Emunah, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu before Matan Torah showed the whole world that he's in charge, that he's leading and directing the world. And then the grandfather can continue to lead the Seder. And of course it should be in language that the children understand. Okay. That's a very interesting approach. I just want to point out something, a thought that I had. Again, this is only the beginning of we have a lot of time to think about this and to consult with people about how to run our Serdorim. But there are aspects that might also be very powerfully done by the grandfather. The grandfather, because he's like connecting them up to an earlier tradition, so that it's coming from the person who lived the longest and has seen the earlier generations, is perhaps a little more powerful when we're talking about transmitting something that came down from earlier. Anyways, that's just it's the father has a special, like Rav Sternbach says, the father has a special way with communicating with his child, 100%. But it could be that there's some things that a grandfather, so to speak, brings to the Seder table, that a father might not. So it's very powerful when a family, grandfather, children, grandchildren, the whole group is there, and hearing it from the person who's from the previous generation. Now, what about B'nai Banim Harein Kebanim? So he quotes Rabbi Akiva Eiger that follows the B'nai Banim Harein Kebanim approach. And he quotes the Be'er Shava that Rabbi Akiva Eiger quotes. And based on this, you should say B'nai Banim Harein Kebanim. In which case, the grandfather is like the father. Meaning, according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, the whole question doesn't start, because the grandfather is a father. And you have two fathers, the grandfather and the father. However, Akasha and Rabbi Akiva Eiger is still a question. Why do we need a pasuk by Talmud Torah, V'udatam levanecha v'livnei vanecha? Don't we say B'nai Banim Harein Kebanim? So, Al-Kei Nira La'anios Daisi She'B'nai Banim Amnam Harein Kebanim. True, grandchildren are like children. Avalova kaboni mamash, not mamish. And when there is a father there, then the grandfather is not commanded. Rabbi Kiva Eger and the Beersheva were speaking about cases of orphans. And then the mitzvah falls upon the grandfather. But again, Rav Sternbach is mechadish here that the principle of B'nai Banim Areim Kebanim is a replacement principle, so to speak. But when the father is there, of Ala Inyan mitzvahs Talmud Torah, nitchadesh b'hai krav afilu yesh lem levenav yesh mitzvah gam al avi aviv. That's a chiddush, that when there's that even though the father's alive, there's still a chiyuv Talmud Torah on the grandfather. Now, so he says beautiful. He says Chazal Darshan on that pasuk. It's the pasuk is Vodatam levanecha v'livnei vanecha Yom asher amadata lifnei Hashem Elokecha b'chorev. The day that you stood before the Mount Sinai experience, the day that you stood before me at Horeb. And Chazal Darshan ma hasam be'ema be'yirim v'reta devazea. The Mount Sinai experience was with fear and awe, with trembling. Imkein hainu lelamdo yiras shamayim. So it teaches yiras shamayim. And that's what the grandfather is doing specially. V'nei asaba shu me'adora kodem, from the earliest generation, Ra'a Gonei Yisrael me'adora, who he saw great Gaonim from the previous generation, Shavdu Hashem be'ima v'yiro pachad Hashem, and they served Hashem with real yiras shamayim. Hare raku yachol limsor le'anechet hazeh lelamdo yiras shamayim mi pachad v'yira me'abor yisbarach shemo. He's able to give over the yiras shamayim in a way that perhaps the father can't do. Lachein bazeh mitzvah ala saba. There, the mitzvah is on the grandfather. Ulinyan zeh hareu ki aviv mamash. He's like his mamash, like his father. Mashenkin b'mitzvahs Talmud Torah achiyuv al aviv lelamdo liskor malav rakim eino yochol azai hachiyuv al avi ben. Meaning, when it comes to giving over the Mount Sinai experience and giving over the Yirat Shamayim, so that the grandfather does, especially when it comes to Talmud Torah, the grandfather is there as a backup for the father. Anyways, this is his conclusion right over here is as follows. Let's read his conclusion and then we will close. When married children who are, says Rav Sternbach, married children, again, this is one tshuva. This is not a shir in practical halacha. It's a shir in shilas and tshuvas who deal with practical halacha, but it's getting the discussion going. Banima nisuim mitarchim etzel asaba l'leila seder. Married children who are by the grandfather for the seder night. So the father should himself explain to the son who asks him about the foundations, like Avadim Ayinu and etc., in order for himself to fulfill the mitzvah of telling over to his son. Again, every seder is going to be different, and seeing how to do this in a proper way is very important. Uvehemshech Yomar sheme'achshav moser. And then afterwards, he passes it back on to his father. Okay, he goes on to speak about other things. There is a side to say that the grandfather is obligated because B'nai Banim Hareim Kebanim. And certainly if the grandfather could do it better. But still, he thinks that the father should make sure that the Manishtana and Avadim Hayinu should be with the father's son. Okay, I don't want to bring up a new topic of the difference between Avia Av and Avia Bat. Okay, so in short, we saw Rabbi Kiva Eger, who took a broad B'nai Banim Hareim Kebanim approach, that a grandfather would be able to say Lachniso Berbiso Shel Avram Avinu, number one, because he's chayv in Talmud Torah towards the grandson, and the bracha of Lachniso Berbiso Shel Avram Avinu, like the Levush says, is not on the Mila itself, but it's on all the brach, all the mitzvahs that are coming once this child is in the covenant. On the other hand, he also brings, based on the Beersheva, that and comparing bris milah to pidyon haben, b'nei banim areim kamanim, grandchildren are like children. The Rav Sternbach mistayeg tzat. He's a little bit hesitant on this. He holds that when on the Seder night, even though there is a side to say b'nei banim hareim kebanim, at first he goes that maybe the son himself should make sure that he does avadim ayinu and the Manishtan Shavdi asked him, if the grandfather is a shaliach, well, it has to be only if the grandfather can do it as well as the father. But if the father has special abilities to give it over to his child, so that might not be a good idea. On the other, we pointed out there might be some special sides to a grandfather giving it over because he's from the previous generation. To tell over to your children and your grandchildren what those things that I wrought in Egypt that Hashem made happen. So the Seder night, when there's a grandfather and his children and their children, that's kind of touchy, and he has both approaches here. So he's like a little hesitant, but gives a couple suggestions on how to maneuver that situation. That is what I wanted to share with you today. Those two tshuvas.
Thank you.
And we will be meeting after Pesach. We're gonna take a Pesach break now, and then along with the yeshiva, and then we'll be back when the yeshiva comes back. Wishing everybody a Chag Kosher v'Sameach, and God willing, I'll send out some links to some of our previous Pesach talks.